Hi, I'm Dan Hamermesh. I'm Network Director at the IZA and Editor-in-Chief of the IZA World of Labor. I'm really pleased to introduce this set of interviews I had over the past week with leading labor scholars in several different countries. All of them have thought about the coronavirus crisis, effect on labor markets, effects on the economy, and I just want to chat with them and get a perspective. The interesting thing is the countries covered have had vastly different experiences in terms of how they've managed the crisis, the extent to which cases have occurred, deaths have occurred. I thought it'd be really interesting to have this kind of comparative set of interviews going on. The set of interviews was put together by the co-producers, Theodora Ruseva and Olga Notmeyer, and the script was mostly written by Theodora herself. So I hope you enjoy this, and I think it's just really fascinating to look at how different things are across the different markets.
It's a pleasure this morning, and it's both morning here in Texas where I'm sitting, and it's morning in Valparaiso, Chile, where we have today Professor Diana Kruger, who's a professor at Adolfo Ibáñez University in Valparaiso. For those who are not familiar, Valparaiso is not quite a suburb, it's rather the seaside city adjacent to Santiago de Chile. And it's a real pleasure to have Diana here. Thank you for joining us this morning, Diana.
Thanks, Dan, for the invitation.
What I'd like to do is ask you a few questions about what's going on in Chile in response to the COVID-19 crisis, focusing on government programs and the labor market. So the first thing to ask is, what has the government done in terms of the economy to shore things up in times of lockdown and reduced demand?
Yeah, the government has a couple of strategies in place that they were very quick to put, to get going when the whole pandemic started for us, which was around early March to mid-March, were the first confirmed cases. So on the business side, the government has put in place a liquidity program. They were very concerned about liquidity for small and medium-sized firms, especially because they generate more than 80% of employment. So they put out basically loan guarantees for enterprises to make sure they had enough working capital. They tried to protect employment as much as possible. So along with that liquidity, also the government allowed for, they delayed payments of taxes for these enterprises, for all firms really. So they also came along with tax breaks and just to make sure that these small companies had enough liquidity. That's one aspect of the government strategy. And at first there have been some problems in the implementation, but for the most part, this liquidity program is being managed through the banking system, and it's already set up and running. Then the second part has to do more with the regulatory framework. The government passed a law to protect employment. So in Chile, I'm not sure if you're aware that unemployment insurance is pretty much set up through private accounts. So when you're employed, so you have these private, each of us contributes to their unemployment insurance fund. But in order to access those savings, you have to be fired. Your legal contract has to be terminated. And the early measures also allowed people to come to an agreement with their employer, and where the employer doesn't terminate your employment relationship, but they do continue to pay your Social Security and your contribution to health and pension funds, but they allow you to tap into your uninsurance claim. So you're not legally fired, but you're not going to work because a lot of businesses are closed. The government closed down. Basically, in our city, which you said, is by the ocean, we depend a lot on tourism. All restaurants and hotels are basically shut down. So someone who's working at a firm that isn't open, they're not fired, so the company doesn't have to pay compensation and severance pay, and they can access their private uninsurance claims. Now, that money, you don't get 100% of your wage. You get, it's a sliding scale. You begin the first month getting 70%, and it eventually will dwindle. But that was sort of an emergency reaction back in March, and we'll see what happens once the uninsurance funds begin to run out for people.
Is there any direct? Let me ask you: is there any direct payment from the government to households, or is it just through the unemployment insurance funds?
Right. Well, that's the third part of the government support. The third part is the direct subsidy to households. And so Chile has this long history of, we have very good data on households. It has a long history of focalized social subsidies. So initially, it was very easy to identify households who were qualified for social benefits. So those households are receiving direct subsidies. They have to go through this process of showing, that they're unemployed and that they're in the lowest 60% of the income distribution. They're all qualifying for benefits, for direct subsidies. It's not, I forgot to do the math, but it's about 80% of the minimum wage. That's pretty much the amount that these households are receiving. What's happened in the last few months is, as you can imagine, as more people are losing their jobs or losing their income, then more people are applying to become, to be on the social registry. But that's pretty much where the main strategies of the government have been, as well as some direct distribution of goods.
So the question is, given these income requirements, which that's pretty much unique from all the countries I've talked with, that's sort of neat that there's an income cutoff. What is this doing? What has the crisis done, in your view, so far to inequality in Chile?
Yeah, that was so. Last year we had a pretty big social uprising in Chile in October, which was, in my view, as you know, I'm not Chilean. I've been living here for almost 20 years. So to me, as a foreigner and living outside of Santiago, the level of inequality existing in the country was always very evident, and having had experience in other in poorer countries, it was always very interesting to me how it wasn't so evident to everybody how unequal, because the country has done really well in terms of averages, average income per capita. It's a high income country and so on, but it already had one of the largest inequalities in the world and in Latin America for sure. The crisis then has made those inequalities worse. The spread of the virus was very quick to go from the very high income areas of Santiago. It's a very geographically segregated country as well. So it began in the very high income counties of Santiago. Santiago is huge. It has about 35 separate counties. And the very first cases were in the upper income counties. But as is the case in the US, also lower income people work in the high income counties. And so the virus spread very quickly along sort of like the metro corridor. People take public transportation to get to their jobs. And it spread very quickly to the low income areas of Santiago and to the rest of the country. So the underlying inequalities, I think, played a role in how fast the virus spread. And since the economy has been contracting and unemployment has been going up, then obviously we see huge differences in the ability of homes to deal with the economic crisis, even staying safe. So most people who are working from home are people who are high income. people who are lower income work in jobs that don't allow them to work from home. So I think in the end, this will make the already high inequality, it will probably have made it worse. There's this large literature in economics about the ability to deal with shocks, and people like myself, high education, high income, high skilled, in the event of me losing a job, I have a lot of ways to deal with that, savings and high levels in my unemployment insurance account. But somebody who's made a low income their whole lives, their unemployment insurance account has a very little money in it, and they're going to run out very quickly. So I think in the end, unfortunately, inequality will probably be worse.
So what you're saying, it sounds like, is the worst is yet to come economically. Is that correct?
It's hard to think about that, to live in a world when you don't know if things will ever get better. But yeah, I think that in the end, there will be a lot of pressure on the government in terms of social spending that maybe wasn't necessary before, in an age where tax revenue is also going to be going down. So yeah, I think that the next couple of years for all countries are going to be really hard. But Chile has the reason for its success, I think, is these institutions in place to assure fiscal responsibility. So that's going to be a challenge in the future, how to maintain some degree of fiscal responsibility with all these pressing demands in times of lowering, tax revenue. I don't know how they're going to do it, but that's what I see in the future.
Thanks. Let me ask you this, okay? From as I understand it, students graduated secondary school and university probably before the crisis, right? Like in December or so on and so
Yes.
forth?
Yes.
Okay. Now, that being the case, you don't yet have a new group of graduates looking for jobs and not finding them. That hasn't
Not
happened
yet.
yet, right?
No,
But it's
that will
going to
happen
happen,
in
isn't it?
December. Yeah, it will happen in December.
Okay. And so what do you foresee that happening to unrest, unemployment, everything like that?
So I mentioned the crisis. We have a lot of things on the horizon because we had this social uprising in October and came to a very wide, tense but political agreement to have a referendum in October. It was supposed to be in April, but it was postponed to October, and I'm not sure when it will happen now, but it's a referendum on whether we want to reform the Constitution. And so regarding your question about unrest, recent surveys show that most people agree that we should not have the referendum while the pandemic is going on. So in one sense, this crisis is sort of, I believe, overshadowing the concerns. More than 80% of the people, when they were asked back in December and November, all wish to change the Constitution. So it's expected that referendum is going to be a huge, a huge margin in favor of changing the Constitution. But now, given the pandemic, most people are saying, let's wait. Right now is not the time to be thinking about that. So I'm not sure. Maybe this will help, for us not to go into a crisis because there are other matters. Most people are in favor of schools remaining closed down, and they're in favor of all these strict lockdown measures, despite the fact that it's meaning, hard times economically.
Interesting. Let me ask you this, okay? I mean, someday this will all be over. My guess is that won't happen until we have a widely available, effective, and safe vaccine. That's my guess. So we're talking a year, be my guess, a year from now anyway. I think that'd be optimistic. But someday it will be over. That being the case, a lot of us, like you, me, and many others, have gotten used to working flexibly from home and so on. Do you think that will continue at all, or we go back to the status quo ex ante? And if so, how many people do you think, what fraction of the workforce will be involved in this new mode of operation?
So I'm going to answer as Latin American living in Chile. um, our culture will not go for telework. It's
Okay.
it's been very interesting. I'm an introvert, but I am missing the social contact, with my colleagues, and I can sense it in all of the circles that I am connected to, both work and family, friends, and so on. It's really, I don't think that this mode of communication can, replace the real, both effective and also intellectual um, uh, stimulation and creativity that goes on when you're in the same room with someone and you can, feed off each other's not just ideas but also gestures and so I don't know that this will become, at least in Chile and Latin America, that working from home will replace actual physical contact in a huge amount. Maybe for very specific things, or what I hope is that it gives people flexibility. Like it takes away the taboo that if you're at home, you're not working, which was kind of a stigma before. So, for example, if people are sick, maybe their employer will be okay with them staying home and working from home. Or if a woman has a sick child, that maybe she can also do so from home. Again, in these high skill jobs that are reserved for a very privileged few.
I think perhaps a way to think about that, that's an interesting point you're raising. Perhaps a way to think about it is that for people in jobs which require a lot of creativity and presumably interactions, this mode may not work. But for less creative jobs or skilled, but jobs that don't require this interaction, perhaps at that level, which we're talking sort of these third, not the top, but the third quartile of the labor market. Perhaps that's the area where you might see much more of this kind of online stuff.
Yeah,
But
I believe
again,
so. Like
the
maybe,
culture matters a lot too, of course, and I think the Chilean culture might do better with face to face than with the American culture.
yeah, I would say that that would be true for any Latin American country. And it's interesting that part of we were talking about how the number of cases in Chile has gone up in recent months and just now starting to see, a little bit of tapering off. Some of that is due to people not adhering to the lockdown. We also, back in March, when the strict measures came in place and schools were shut down, we also had a curfew set in place that we've been under a curfew nationally since March 16th, which is, you can't be on the streets between, I believe it's either 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. And the police is out there arresting people who are going to parties and socializing, not as much as the beginning, but there is this cultural factor of, resistance to not being able to see family and friends. Not so much resistance of going to work, but seeing family and friends is really, really important in the Latin culture.
For those who are watching, you should know Deanna Kruger spent her undergraduate years at the University of Texas. And Deanna, certainly, if you think there's like this in Chile, can you imagine Texans dealing with a curfew? We don't deal with it at all. And the
No.
reason we're having a spike in cases is that all the 20-somethings were spending their time last month in bars infecting each other and are now
Yes.
infecting everybody else. And I worry that the same thing might happen in Chile if you let up a little bit on curfews, lockdowns, etc. Let me finish by asking, do you think that will happen, or will they be able to keep the lockdown going sufficiently long to kill off the virus until vaccines are available? It's a prediction
Yeah,
I'm asking about.
I mentioned, these cases of people not respecting curfews are pretty much the exception. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that because um, I've been living away from Texas for a long time, and just from the U.S. in general, and seeing at what's happening around the world, I've really learned a lot about the mindset of people in countries where the state plays a very active role in regulating public health. Like, so even though there are these exceptional cases of people not respecting curfew, I see that people in Chile, for the most part, are very responsive. So I have to qualify that. But right now, as things are, I think that there will be, we will continue to have strict lockdown measures for at least throughout the winter for us, because even though there may or may not be a scientific evidence about the winter and the virus, there is concern in the hospital system that usually gets flooded in these times of years with just regular flu cases. So the concern here is that we don't want to throw another element of stress into the public, public health system. So I think people will adhere to this at least throughout the winter. We'll see what happens in the spring. In the spring, it's harder to convince people it's a good idea to stay indoors. But, what is different is that there's strict enforcement. The military is out on the streets. I went out for an errand about a month ago, and they asked to see your permit. You can go out of your house, but you need to have a permit. And as you know, we have a national ID card. So I was asked, could I please see your permit? Very polite, but there is control. When I go to the supermarket right now, they ask to see my permit that I can be out and about buying food. So that's very different from the way things are done in Texas, for sure.
It certainly is. Look, yeah, let me thank you very much for being with me this morning. It's a pleasure seeing you again.
Great to see you too. Thanks so much, Dan.